I don't think you can beat the craze behind the growing subgenre of horror cinema, the werewolf movies that have been entertaining audiences for several decades now. From action-packed werewolf showdowns to werewolf comedies, we have had just about everything, and there is something gripping about the genre that I cannot ever let go. While I consider myself rather well-versed with the overall werewolf mythology, I also enjoy the new additions to the lore in these movies, and there have been far too many werewolf movies over the years that will be remembered for their uniqueness. With that being said, there are some that still remain relatively underrated, and in this video, I will bring you a great collection of such movies.
Somebody has to...
Dog Soldiers, 2002. I saw Neil Marshall's Dog Soldiers in 2002 on a packed Friday night back when British horror was hungry and mean and nobody was promising you a cinematic universe. Marshall wrote, directed, and even edited the film like he was sharpening a knife, turning a modest training exercise setup into a full-moon combat picture. It was his feature debut, built on a lean budget and attitude, and you could feel the ingenuity in every scene of the film. A squad of soldiers is dropped into the Scottish Highlands, the mission goes sideways, and the wilderness starts hunting back. You all know what that means, don't you? What makes it sing is how physical everything feels. The werewolves are more than your typical dreamy metaphors, and they feel like a practical nightmare, slamming into doors, windows, and human confidence. Mark Thomas's score keeps a pulse under the bravado, and Marshall stages the action like a siege thriller, where one farmhouse becomes a bunker, every hallway a kill corridor, and every bullet and negotiation with panic. Sean Pertwee's Granite Sergeant charisma, Kevin McKidd's frantic decency, and Liam Cunningham's coiled threat. All these guys feel like real professionals losing the script in real time. And the movie's secret weapon is camaraderie. The banter is an armor cracked by blood and moonlight. There are images you don't forget, such as the flares turning the night into hell's stage lighting. There is a training joke about dogs curdling into terror, and I fondly remember a desperate barricade built out of furniture and stubbornness, and that sickening realization that the enemy isn't just outside, it's inside the rules of the world. Dog Soldiers earned its cult crown by making lycanthropy a tactical problem you can almost solve until you can't. If you rewatch it, you will realize that the tension still bites, the jokes still land, and the full moon still feels like a deadline. Project Metalbeast, 1995. In the mid-90s, when video stores were temples and the direct-to-video aisle was lawless, Project Metalbeast arrived with a pitch so dumb it loops back into genius. The story revolves around building the perfect soldier by injecting lycanthrope blood and then weaponizing the result. Director Alessandro De Gaetano taps the era's fascination with biotech overreach, delivering a Frankenstein tale under fluorescent lab lights, and it never apologizes for its pulp ambitions either. The setup is pure bad science. A test subject is transformed, the outcome is too volatile to control, and the only solution is cryogenic denial until the creature wakes up years later and the facility becomes a maze of alarms, steel doors, and desperate containment plans. Barry Bostwick brings weary authority, Kim Delaney supplies the human urgency, and then Kane Hodder does what he does best, where he makes the monster feel like it has mass. I am a huge fan of the werewolf in this movie. It's a battering ram, a stuntman's ferocity in a suit, crashing through the frame without the elegance. As a werewolf movie, Metalbeast stands out because it treats lycanthropy as both curse and upgrade. The body horror is remarkable, and I am a fan of the unsettling implication that folklore can be turned into a product line. You get the pleasures you came for, from transformations, stalking corridors, and sudden brutal impacts. But you also get the cold comedy of scientists realizing they built a predator for a boardroom PowerPoint. Is it slick? No. Is it memorable? Well, I certainly think so. Its cult appeal lives in the audacity of the hybrid of Wolfman energy colliding with 90s techno-thriller vibes. All grit and ambition. I strongly recommend watching this film because it will be like revisiting your grimy VHS era, half for the creature, half for the time capsule confidence that any idea, if committed hard enough, could become a movie. Ginger Snaps, 2000. I caught Ginger Snaps in 2000 right in that glossy post-Scream moment, when teen horror was supposed to be sleek, quippy, and disposable. Then director John Fawcett and writer Karen Walton dropped this Canadian gut punch, and the werewolf movie felt dangerous again, because it wasn't just about a curse, it was about becoming. The film was clearly built to weaponize the era's high school cliches, but if you ask me, I will still talk about the implications of puberty that come so hard and strong. Brigitte, played by Emily Perkins, and Ginger, played by Catherine Isabelle, are morbid misfits who treat death as a shared hobby, staging faux corpse photo art as a love language. Then, on the night Ginger gets her first period, something in the dark bites her, and the metaphor stops being polite. The town of Bailey Downs is all beige hallways, locker room cruelty, and Halloween lawns, shot with a chilly normality that makes every bloody detail pop. Mike Shields' score hums with unease as Ginger's body changes in ways nobody warned them about. Brigitte clings to their bond, chasing a cure with Sam, the local dealer, while Ginger leans into the new hunger and the new power. The iconic moments don't rely on jump scares. They're slow burn shocks, such as the reveal of what's stalking the neighborhood or the way accidents pile up while adults refuse to name the monster. I love the way new power feels like both liberation and doom, and the late film confrontations where sisterhood and survival collide in the same room are truly memorable. As a werewolf movie, it's brutal, funny, and morally gray because lycanthropy has been used as a metaphor for sexuality, appetite, rage, and power, with no tidy lesson to soften the bite. That's why Ginger Snaps became a cult staple. It's intimate horror with teeth, and every time you watch it, makes the tragedy sharper and the jokes darker. It's feminist, feral, and heartbreakingly human beneath all the blood. Late Phases 2014. When Late Phases premiered in 2014, I loved how someone finally asked the genre's bluntest question. What if The Last Stand isn't a cabin full of teens, but a retirement community full of people the world has already stopped seeing? Director Adrian Garcia Bogliano, working from Eric Stolz's script, builds the film like a siege thriller with bruised humanity. I remember the room getting quieter as the premise clicked perfectly. These residents are survivors who've already outlived the stories movies usually tell them about, which makes their protagonist role all the more interesting. Nick D'Amici carries it as Ambrose McKinley, a blind war vet who moves into a gated community and immediately senses the pattern behind the attacks. The setup is deliciously practical, where moon phases act as scheduling, floor plans as strategy, and neighbors as liabilities. Bogliano shoots the place with sad, lived-in texture, so when the horror arrives it feels like something violating a space meant for quiet. The werewolf violence is nasty and physical, but it's never just noise because every bite fractures trust, routines, and dignity. The iconic sequences are built on tension you can taste, such as a sudden night assault that turns routine safety into chaos, a hunt where sound and instinct replace sight, and grimly funny moments as people realize the HOA never planned for lycanthropy. What makes it great as a werewolf film is its moral grayness. Ambrose isn't fighting for glory, but he's fighting to matter, to protect strangers, and to keep his own grief from swallowing him. The monster outside is real, but so is the loneliness inside. Late Phases earned cult status because it drags the werewolf myth out of the teenage metaphor and into aging, vulnerability, and stubborn dignity. Even after all these years, the siege still holds, the emotions still sting, and the moon still feels like a deadline in the best way. Monster Dog 1984. I first stumbled onto Monster Dog in the 80s the way you're supposed to discover a movie this strange, on a battered rental tape with cover art that promised teeth and delivered delirium. Claudio Fragasso directs like he's making a rock video that got infected by a creature feature, and casting Alice Cooper isn't a gimmick, it's the film's bloodstream. Cooper plays Vincent Raven, a shock rock star who drags his crew back to his hometown to shoot a video, only to find the place whispering about savage attacks in the woods. The setup is classic small-town dread, but the flavor is pure Euro horror oddity. Foggy nights, suspicious locals, and that slight off-kilter English language sheen that makes everything feel like a dream that you can't quite wake from. The sheriff warns about ripped-up bodies, the countryside feels contaminated, and the town's denial curdles into paranoia. Fragasso stages the violence with lurid confidence, sudden lurges, frantic searches, blood on stone, and then leans on atmosphere, turning base basements and corridors into backstage tunnels to something ancient. As a werewolf-adjacent ride, Monster Dog is less tragic curse and more animal panic. The familiar becomes predatory, the night air feels poisonous, and the soundtrack energy keeps the movie vibrating like an amp about to blow. Silly, sure, but the menace stays surprisingly sharp. The best sequences run on pure vibe, such as the moonlit prowls, terrified flashlights cutting through mist, faces caught between disbelief and survival instinct, while Cooper's persona anchors it all, making the film feel like a concert that accidentally summons a monster. Put it on with friends, laugh at the oddness, and then notice how the fog still creeps in when the lights go down.
What?
The Wolf of Snow Hollow 2020. I watched The Wolf of Snow Hollow on its 2020 day and date release, and it hit like a werewolf movie filtered through a nervous breakdown with a murder mystery mixed with deadpan comedy and bruised emotion. Jim Cummings writes, directs, and stars, and you can feel the low-budget ingenuity in every beat, from the dialogue to the jokes. The premise is classic, where you have a small Utah mountain town that wakes up to bodies shredded in the snow, clawed like something out of folklore. The air feels razor cold and hostile, and you know you are in for some hard-hitting werewolf action. Cummings plays Deputy John Marshall, a man with anger issues and alcoholism trying to hold a badge, a family, and his sanity in the same shaky hands. The movie's best sequences can inspire future filmmakers pursuing the genre, and there is a crime scene so brutal that it silences the room. I still cannot get over the station house blow-up where grief turns into gallows humor, and night patrols where the dark tree line feels like it's watching you. Ricky Lindholm brings grounded skepticism as an investigator who refuses John's excuses, and Robert Forster on his final screen role gives the film its bruised heart. As a werewolf film, Snow Hollow is a sly reinvention because it makes uncertainty the monster. It keeps you hovering between supernatural expectation and the banal horror of human violence, and that tension mirrors John's spiral because the harder he needs the world to make sense, the less it does. It's about masculinity cracking under pressure, inherited damage, and the stories we tell so chaos feels organized. I completely understand why it's regarded as a cult classic now. Press play and let the snow swallow the streetlights. Were 2013. I saw Were when it first started circulating among genre obsessives, and it felt like somebody finally rebuilt the werewolf movie as a modern thriller instead of a gothic bedtime story. Writer-director William Brent Bell made it in the found footage era, but this isn't shaky cam gimmickry, but a procedural that uses cameras, paperwork, and clinical detail to make the supernatural feel like an evidence problem. A defense attorney, Kate, takes a case that looks open and shut. A man named Talan is accused of slaughtering a tourist family in rural France. But of course, there is a lot more brewing than what meets the eye. Bell's camera language makes everything mysterious through dash cams, phones, and harsh lights, and I love how it turns folklore into something truly terrifying. The early stretch tightens like a courtroom noose. Police want closure, the press wants a headline, and Kate wants to believe reason can beat fear. Supporting players like Sebastian Roche bring institutional pressure, and every new fact feels like a nail. Then the film pivots and detonates. When the beast breaks free, Were turns Paris into a trap through sirens, concrete, underpasses, and terrified crowds. And Bell shoots the chaos with kinetic panic that makes the city feel suddenly small. The transformation is violent, animal, and ugly in the best way, a creature that moves like hunger with no romance attached. What makes Were great as a werewolf film is its moral grayness. It's about what we do to monsters when we're wrong, and what happens when we're right for the worst reasons. If you ask me, I will say it is a rare hybrid where you get a legal thriller, chase movie, and creature feature in one bruised package. Werewolves 2024. I caught Werewolves on its December 2024 release weekend, and it played like the kind of pulp action horror studios used to unleash on a dare. Director Stephen C. Miller and writer Matthew Kennedy take a glorious blunt premise, where one night of supermoon light turns people into killers, and stretch it into a ticking clock survival thriller where science, family, and sheer firepower have to hold the line until dawn. Frank Grillo is perfect as Wesley, a soldier turned scientist with the exhausted intensity of a guy who's seen the apocalypse twice. The world building is the hook. This is a recurring mass event where streets get boarded up, windows become liabilities, and moonlight turns into a predator you can't negotiate with. The moon block experiment adds a grim sci-fi edge to the carnage. The best scenes are built on that rule, where light equals transformation, and every flashlight beam feels like a moral choice. When the monsters arrive, the film leans into physical mayhem, proudly emphasizing practical creature work so the werewolves feel present, heavy, and close enough to smell. As a werewolf movie, Werewolves is unapologetically about brutality and panic on a society-wide scale. Here, surviving one night doesn't mean you're whole when the moon comes back a year later. Supporting turns from Katrina Law and Lou Diamond Phillips add texture to the barricade mentality, and the cinematography finds nasty beauty in beams of light that feel like weapons. Legacy-wise, it's already carving out a cult lane as the action werewolf pandemic movie, the kind you throw on with friends and quote between set pieces. Brotherhood of the Wolf 2001. When I first watched Brotherhood of the Wolf, it felt like somebody cracked open a history book, poured in Hong Kong fight cinema, then splashed the whole thing with Baroque blood. Christophe Gans's French blockbuster takes the beast of Gévaudan legend and doesn't adapt it so much as remix it into a delirious genre cocktail, complete with period mystery, conspiracy thriller, gothic horror, and swashbuckling action. Dan Lauston's cinematography makes the forests look like oil paintings that can bite. Samuel Le Bihan plays naturalist Fransac, dispatched to a countryside drowning in fear, with Marc Dacascos Mani as his lethal shadow. Around them, Emile Dequesne brings warmth and steel, Monica Bellucci drips seduction, and Vincent Cassel radiates decadent rot, turning every political exchange into a threat. Gans stages set pieces like legends being formed in real time, rain-soaked huts, tavern brawls, midnight ambushes, and the creature moments land with savage theatricality, punctuated by Joseph Loduca's propulsive score and Jacques Perrin's storybook narration. What makes it essential on a werewolf list is the atmosphere of superstition colliding with power. The monster is fear as a tool, and the way civilization can be more predatory than any beast. Even the costumes and choreography scream spectacle, daring you to resist it. Brotherhood of the Wolf earned its must-watch status by being audaciously maximalist. It is one of the rare entries that feels like an adventure epic. Its cult reputation keeps growing because nobody else makes movies quite like this anymore.
Nice talking.
Bad Moon, 1996. I rented Bad Moon in 1996 expecting a standard family stalked by lycanthrope programmer and got something stranger. It is a werewolf movie that secretly belongs to the dog. Writer-director Eric Red adapts Wayne Smith's novel Thor, famously told largely from the dog's viewpoint, and even when the film sits with the humans, you can feel the canine logic underneath. Mariel Hemingway plays Janet, a single mom trying to rebuild a quiet life. Michael Paré is her brother Ted, returning from a trip with a haunted look and a secret he can't share. The setup is suburbia in peril, but the tone has a nervy edge. Daniel Licht's score keeps a low, anxious thrum under the domestic scenes, like the house itself is bracing. The woods feel too close, and every family moment carries that "is tonight the night?" tension. The creature effects are the main attraction, a bulky, snarling beast that feels heavy in the frame, with kill scenes that are messy, brutal, and satisfyingly practical in impact, even when the 90s polish shows its seams. Ted isn't just a monster, he is essentially family, and that proximity makes every growl feel like betrayal. Then there's Thor, the German Shepherd played with such focus you start treating every warning bark like narration. He's the one who senses the truth first, the one who understands that protecting the pack might mean being misunderstood by it. That's the film's emotional hook, with love expressed as vigilance, loyalty expressed as violence, and the tragedy of being right too early. Bad Moon bombed, sure, but it kept a cult afterlife because it delivers what werewolf fans like me crave. It has the household siege tension, transformation dread, and a creature that looks like it could tear a door off. When I watched the movie Good Boy recently in 2025, it brought back fresh memories from this werewolf classic. Howl, 2015. In 2015, when modern monster movies were leaning hard on CGI gloss, Howl showed up like a breath of fresh air, and I immediately became a fan. Director Paul Hyatt is a creature and effects veteran, and writers Mark Huckerby and Nick Osler take a simple, cruelly smart pitch: a late-night commuter train stranded in the countryside, and turn it into a pressure cooker where the timetable becomes a death sentence. I find the setup to be just perfect, where a junior guard is trying to do his job. A handful of passengers already irritated and tired are in for the journey of a true nightmare, and then the night outside starts moving wrong. The genius is how quickly the film makes the safe space feel temporary. Every carriage door is a thin promise, and every window is an invitation. When the attacks begin, Hyatt stages the mayhem like a siege movie in a hallway, all cramped angles and panicked pivots, with Sean Pertwee bringing that battered authority that sells the group dynamics instantly. I think the movie really works because it treats lycanthropy like an outbreak. You can hear breathing in the dark. The violence is blunt, the atmosphere is greasy with fear, and the creature movements hit with that satisfying physical something is actually there wait. You get iconic flashes without the movie tipping its hand too early, and the scenes haunted me for a long time, with a frantic scramble between cars, blood on metal, faces lit by emergency glow, and that horrible realization that the only direction left is forward into more night. I love the class tension and desperation, strangers negotiating leadership, cowardice, and sacrifice while the monsters keep testing the weak seams in their little human alliance. Howl earned its cult status by being lean, nasty, and proudly old school in spirit. It is the kind of late night watch that makes you side-eye empty stations and listen harder to the wind, so you really don't want to miss out on this one. The Company of Wolves, 1984. Back in 1984, The Company of Wolves felt like a fairy tale, and while I was late to the party, the movie still impressed me when I watched it almost a decade later. Director Neil Jordan and writer Angela Carter didn't make a werewolf movie so much as they made a dream about why werewolf stories exist and why they keep biting deeper as you get older. The setup is nested like folklore itself, and a girl's feverish dream becomes the frame, and inside it you get tales that spiral around the same hungry idea that the woods are not just woods, they're adulthood waiting with teeth. Sarah Patterson plays the dreamer at the center, while Angela Lansbury carries the grandmotherly gravity that makes the warnings sound like scripture. Jordan shoots it with lush storybook menace, forests like velvet traps, interiors lit like candlelit confessionals, and transformations that feel less action beats and more like taboo breaking through the skin. As a werewolf film, it thrives on atmosphere and moral grayness. The monster is temptation, such as a wedding turning uncanny, werewolves moving like rumors through the trees, red cloth and red mouths, and faces that blur between man and animal as if identity is just a costume that can be ripped off. Its uniqueness is that it's erotic, literary, and genuinely unsettling without needing to sprint. The legacy of this movie is immense, and many see this as a cornerstone of feminist gothic horror, a cult favorite for people who want their werewolves poetic and poisonous. Silver Bullet, 1985. In 1985, Silver Bullet landed right in that sweet spot where Stephen King adaptations still felt like campfire stories. King wrote the screenplay, adapting his own Cycle of the Werewolf, and director Dan Attias shaped it into a small-town nightmare that feels both cozy and sickening. The setup is pure Stephen King. It is the story of a town that thinks it knows itself until bodies start turning up torn open, and the adults do what adults always do in these stories. They deny, rationalize, scapegoat, and then arm themselves. At the center is Marty, a kid in a wheelchair whose vulnerability becomes a kind of clarity, because when you live with limits, you recognize danger faster. Gary Busey as Uncle Red is the film's wild heartbeat, a human firecracker of love and recklessness, the guy who will build you a solution out of junk, faith, and stubbornness. As a werewolf movie, it's a greatest hits mixtape done right, with moonlit stalking, paranoia rising like heat, and that metallic shiver of the title idea, the one clean rule everyone clings to when the world stops making sense. The film's best sequences are all about community turning feral, and you will see everything from vigilantism, sermons that feel like threats, and dreadful sense that the monster might be someone you've shaken hands with. What makes it stand out for me is the emotional through line, Marty's refusal to be helpless, his sister's loyalty, Uncle Red's messy devotion, and the way courage here looks like improvisation, not hero poses. Silver Bullet has stayed in rotation because it's accessible, nasty, and strangely warm, a gateway werewolf film with real bite. When Animals Dream, 2014. In 2014, When Animals Dream arrived like art house horror sharpening its claws in silence. Director Jonas Alexander Arnby, making his feature debut, took the werewolf myth and drained it of spectacle, then rebuilt it as a slow tragedy on a Danish island where everyone knows your name and everyone is watching for you to become wrong. What I like about the setup is that it is deceptively plain. Marie, isolated and restless, lives with her father and an ill mother, and her body begins changing in ways the town treats as both disease and scandal. Arnby shoots the landscape with cold patience, water, wind, industrial interiors, and long looks that feel like judgment. The horror comes from the pressure situations, whispers, family secrets, and the sensation that inheritance can be a cage. As a werewolf film, it's brutally precise because it's restrained. The violence, when it comes, feels shocking because the movie earned it through repression. You remember the tactile moments, a rash that looks like destiny, blood that feels out of place in such clean Scandinavian light, and the way Marie's eyes change before her body does, as if her soul got there first. The monster design is less about fangs than about transformation as identity, female rage, sexuality, and survival instinct, all tangled together. I think the best part about this film is the emotional weight, because it's about a young woman realizing the world only loves her when she is controllable, and then deciding what she owes that world. Its legacy is quiet cult devotion, the kind of film people recommend with a serious face, because it isn't just scary, it's sad, and the sadness is the bite. Good Manners, 2017. Good Manners is the rare werewolf film, and I think it went relatively unnoticed even among the genre enthusiasts. In 2017, Brazilian directors and writers Juliana Rojas and Marco Dutra swung for something wildly ambitious, with a part urban fairy tale, part musical-tinged dark fantasy, part maternal melodrama, and then, yes, a creature story that refuses to behave. The story begins in Sao Paulo with Clara, a lonely nurse hired by Ana, a wealthy woman whose pregnancy carries a secret that the film lets you sense before it tells you. The city is shot with a dreamy menace, night buses, apartment shadows, and the soft hum of class divide. Then the story tilts, time shifts, and what could have been a simple monster baby pitch becomes something braver, as a relationship epic about caretaking, fear, and the kind of love society calls monstrous. As a werewolf movie, it's magnetic because it treats the wolf very differently than the stereotype. The full moon violence is there, feral and frightening, but it's threaded through with tenderness and shame, the push and pull between protecting someone and fearing what they might become. You get images that linger like a private room turned into a ritual space, moonlight as a trigger and a curse, a child's hunger reframed as both innocence and threat, and music that makes the emotions swell when you expect the film to go cold. The movie is not about sending a message, but it does spell out how good manners are often just society's way of policing bodies and love. Its cult status keeps growing because nothing else quite tastes like it. Moon of the Wolf, 1972. In 1972, network TV horror had to smuggle its nightmares past the censors, and Moon of the Wolf, an ABC Movie of the Week, did it by leaning into atmosphere and suspicion until the air felt infected. Director Daniel Petrie, adapting a story rooted in Leslie H. Whitten's novel, set the tale in a humid Louisiana town where violence feels ancient, like the bayou has always had something hungry in it. The setup is classic procedural dread with brutal killings, a community getting jumpy, and investigators trying to name what doesn't want to be named. David Janssen anchors it with that steady, worn intelligence, while Barbara Rush and Bradford Dillman give the story its human texture, people trying to stay rational while the night keeps proving them wrong. The TV format actually helps because everything is intimate, such as the conversations on porches, flashlights cutting through trees, the slow turn from gossip to fear. As a werewolf movie, it succeeds by making the monster a rumor first. You don't get operatic transformation theatrics, you get the creeping certainty that a predator is moving just outside the frame. The music and cinematography keep the tension simmering, and the restraint forces your imagination to do the shredding. The best part is its regional mood, that sticky southern gothic vibe where superstition feels like common sense. Its legacy is cult affection among werewolf fans, and a reminder that the subgenre doesn't always need big effects. It needs dread that spreads person to person. Teddy, 2020. In 2020, Teddy came roaring out of France, and the brothers Ludovic and Zoran Bokurma wrote and directed it as a horror comedy that gradually stops being funny in the safe way because the joke turns into a wound. The story starts off with Teddy drifting through rural life before he gets scratched by something out in the hills, and the town's petty routines begin to warp around that one small injury. The Bokurmas shoot the countryside with sunburnt realism, then let the uncanny seep in. Dead sheep, uneasy locals, nights that feel too loud, and a body that starts arguing with itself. The film's genius is the tone. It plays like youth drama, then like monster movie, then like an ugly little parable about masculinity and frustration turning feral. As a werewolf film, Teddy is all about transformation as social eruption. The violence has bite, but the bigger horror is watching a kid who's always been treated as disposable suddenly becoming dangerous, and half the town responds like they've been waiting for an excuse. You remember the moments where the human face slips, or a stare that lasts too long, laughter that turns sharp, a party vibe turning predatory, and the full moon feeling like a cruel spotlight on everything Teddy doesn't know how to control. You will fall in love with the emotional messiness of the film. It's funny, sad, horny, mean, and strangely tender, with the romance grounding the horror instead of softening it. Its cult status has been building because it feels like a fresh flavor, a werewolf movie that dares to stand out. Werewolf by Night, 2022. The thing that really impresses me about Werewolf by Night is how the director, Michael Giacchino, took a compact, pulpy premise and delivered a black and white classic horror love letter that still has modern bite. Written by Heather Quinn and Peter Cameron, it drops us into a secret world of monster hunters gathered for a ritual competition, where grief, rivalry, and old rules collide under torchlight. The setup is deliciously simple and instantly iconic. A gothic estate, a relic everyone wants, and a room full of people who smile like knives. Gael Garcia Bernal plays Jack Russell with a gentle sadness that makes the eventual unleashing hit harder, and Laura Donnelly brings a fierce, wounded nobility that gives the story its emotional spine. There is a distinct 1930s creature feature vibe shot through with modern pacing, hard shadows, sharp sound design, and bursts of violence that feel shockingly tactile for the MCU. As a werewolf story, it works because it honors the duality. The wolf is terrifying, fast, and brutal, but the human underneath is aching, trying to be decent inside a system built on killing. You remember the texture and flickering firelight, claws against stone, hunters realizing they're not the apex predators tonight, and that gorgeous sense of forbidden genre inside a mainstream franchise. The practical effects vibe and Giacchino's monster movie rhythm sell the whole illusion. It does not over-explain, it does not wink itself to death, it just commits to gothic pulp and lets the atmosphere carry the myth. Legacy-wise, it's already a fan favorite because it feels like comfort horror, tight, stylish, and surprisingly heartfelt. Press play and enjoy the rare sensation of a superhero universe making room for old-school monster magic. Werewolf, 2018. I might be biased, but personally, this movie feels like one of the most unique werewolf movies ever made. Director Adrian Panik set it in the summer of 1945 after the liberation of children from a concentration camp, and the title becomes a metaphor that bites harder than fangs. The children are taken to a remote mansion to recover, and then the horror returns. Not supernatural, but animal, as feral dogs released by the SS begin besieging the property. The story plays like a dark fairy tale dragged through history. Starvation, fear, and trauma turn the world into a hostile forest again, and Panic shoots it with the cold clarity of a survival thriller. It's relentless because it's grounded. No silver bullets, no neat rulebook, just children forced to rebuild their humanity, while something trained for violence keeps testing their barricades. Why include it on a must-watch werewolf list? I would say because it captures the emotional engine of the subgenre. The fear of becoming prey, the dread of the pack, the idea that the beast is what violence turns us into. The dogs function like werewolves in folklore, unstoppable, prowling, and symbolic, the past literally hunting the survivors into the present. The most unforgettable moments are not splatter, but choices made. Its legacy is cult reverence among horror fans who like their genre allegorical and sharp. For me, the rewatch value comes from how layered it is, each viewing revealing more about trauma, power, and survival. It's a wolf story that hurts, and that's exactly why it belongs. Romasanta, 2004. In 2004, Romasanta arrived with that delicious early 2000s European horror confidence, filled with period grime, psychological dread, and a true crime backbone dressed in folklore. Director Paco Plaza tells the story of Manuel Romasanta, a man accused of horrific killings who claims he is cursed, a werewolf, a victim of forces bigger than the law. It's produced through the genre-friendly ecosystem of Fantastic Factory, and you can feel the intention. Make the werewolf myth adult again, tied to superstition, repression, and the brutal machinery of reason. Julian Sands plays Romasanta with eerie charisma, a man who can seem gentle until the room gets colder around him. Elsa Pataki brings vulnerability and steel as a woman pulled between affection, fear, and the stories her culture has taught her to believe. The film lives in misty forests and candlelit interiors, where every path looks like it leads to confession or execution. Plaza stages violence with a nasty edge, but the real unease comes from uncertainty. Is this supernatural horror, psychological delusion, or a predator using mythology as camouflage? As a werewolf movie, it works because it weaponizes ambiguity. The transformations, when suggested, feel like the mind trying to survive its own guilt. The monster could be a literal beast or the banality of human cruelty, and the film keeps tightening that noose until you feel the era's moral panic, how quickly a community decides what someone is, and how eagerly institutions turn mystery into punishment. What makes it unique is its flavor, a historical werewolf tale that tastes like courtroom dread and fog-choked folklore, not modern jump scares. I am in awe of the uneasy blend of myth and murder, and how Sands' performance keeps haunting the frame. The best part is that when you rewatch it, the question changes each time, which is the best kind of curse. A Werewolf Boy 2012. When A Werewolf Boy hit in 2012, it felt like someone dared a werewolf story to be tender without going toothless. Writer-director Jo Sung-hee shaped it from a script he first developed while studying at the Korean Academy of Film Arts, and you can feel that careful craftsmanship in how the film paces its emotions like a slow heartbeat under the fur. I love how simple the story is. A teenage girl, Suni, Park Bo-young, is sent to the countryside for her health and stumbles upon a feral boy, Song Joong-ki, hiding on the property. He isn't introduced as a monster, but as a mystery, silent, animal alert, and heartbreakingly human in the way he watches the world like it might hurt him again. Joe shoots the rural spaces with a storybook hush, and then lets dread creep in through social cruelty and class entitlement. What makes it work as a werewolf movie is that the beast is treated as a pressure cooker, not a party trick. The violence isn't constant, but the threat is. Every time someone pushes him, humiliates him, tries to own him, you feel the wolf stirring. Iconic moments land because they're emotional first and small gestures turning into lifelines. And then I get the sickening realization that the real villains don't need claws to be predatory. The atmosphere is romantic, yes, but it's also tragic and morally gray, because the film understands that monstrosity can be something done to you. I find the movie quite artistic in the way it frames lycanthropy as a metaphor for trauma and otherness, then asks whether love can be protective without becoming possessive. The legacy is huge as a modern Korean cult favorite people recommend, because it's one of the rare werewolf films that can break your heart without breaking the spell. Bloodthirsty 2020. I caught Bloodthirsty when it started making noise on the festival circuit, and it felt like a werewolf movie that was almost daringly creative. Director Amelia Moses, working from a script by Wendy Hill Tout and Lowell Boland, takes the classic artist's retreats to make a record setup and twists it into a body horror parable about ambition, exploitation, and the price of letting someone shape you. Lauren Beatty stars as Gray, an indie singer-songwriter invited to a remote wilderness studio by a legendary producer. The location is everything here. There is the isolation that feels luxurious at first, then predatory. The film builds tension like a slow track layering instruments. And because Gray's transformation is tied to creation, every musical moment becomes suspect. Are we witnessing inspiration or infection? As a werewolf film, Bloodthirsty is brutal in an intimate way. It doesn't treat lycanthropy as a spectacle. It treats it as a process of becoming, one that's seductive and humiliating at the same time. Iconic sequences land because they're tactile. The recording sessions feel like rituals. Moonlit wilderness turns into a throat-tightening trap, and then you have moments where the producer's guidance starts reading like grooming. The score work hums with unease, making the studio feel like a den dressed up as a sanctuary. The special element in the film for me is its emotional spine. It's about a woman trying to claim her own voice, while something ancient and hungry claims her body. If you are one of those who love their werewolves artsy, sharp, and painful, watch it and you'll hear the warnings hiding in the melodies. Wildling 2018. I saw Wildling around its 2018 release window and it hit like a coming-of-age nightmare told with mythic confidence. This is a part fairy tale, part trauma story, part creature feature eruption, and I strongly recommend keeping this one handy for your next movie night. Writer-director Fritz Bohm takes a familiar horror archetype, girl raised in captivity, and flips it into something deadlier. What if the monster story you were told as a child was actually your origin myth? Belle Powley plays Anna, raised in isolation by Daddy, warned endlessly about a creature called the Wildling waiting outside. When she's freed into the care of a sheriff, the film initially feels like recovery with new clothes, new routines, and cautious hope. But Bohm keeps the frame tense, like the world is simply changing cages. Then the body horror starts whispering. Anna's past is biological, and the film's best moments come from that sickening overlap between trauma symptoms and transformation sign. As a werewolf-adjacent film, Wildling earns its place because it taps the same primal engine. You will see the terror and liberation of becoming something the world will call unnatural. The violence, when it arrives, feels like a dam breaking. You get vivid sequences without the movie blowing all its mysteries at once. Paul Haslinger's score keeps an anxious pulse under the tenderness, and the visuals are worth teaching in film schools. The strongest asset of the film is the emotional through line. Anna isn't just escaping a man, she's escaping a narrative and reclaiming her own body from fear, shame, and control. Its cult reputation lives in that mixture of bruised realism and mythic payoff. Wolfen, 1981. When Wolfen came out in 1981, it played like the city itself had grown teeth. Director Michael Wildling, adapting Whitley Strieber's novel, merges crime thriller urgency with an almost spiritual predator myth, and the result feels uniquely urban with concrete canyons, burnt-out neighborhoods, and a sense that something ancient is stalking modern decay. The setup starts with a brutal, high-profile murder, and a detective trying to make sense of wounds that don't fit a human weapon. The genius is how the film expands outward, and finding the killer soon becomes unraveling the mystery of the city. With Gregory Hines and Edward James Olmos adding sharp texture, Wolfen turns investigation into descent in marginalized spaces, into political rot, into the uncomfortable idea that the monster might be tied to the land the city has tried to erase. As a werewolf-adjacent horror film, it's unforgettable because it reframes the predator. These are hunters with rules, intelligence, and a terrifying sense of purpose. The film's most iconic tool is its perspective, predator vision that makes the city look like a heat map of vulnerability. And once you've seen these shots, you never quite trust darkness the same way. James Horner's score pushes the tension with a restless primal pulse, and Wadley stages the kills with a cold shock that keeps the thriller gears turning. The film is about gentrification, displacement, and the way progress can feel like a massacre with better PR. This one is a must-watch for the horror fans who want their wolf stories smart, political, and eerie in a way that doesn't date. Wolf Cop 2014. I watched Wolf Cop when it first hit its midnight movie stride, and writer-director Lowell Dean takes a premise that sounds like a fake trailer. The story is about an alcoholic cop who becomes a werewolf and keeps policing, and the director makes it work by playing everything dead serious inside the insanity. Leo Fafard stars as Lou Garou, a deputy who's already self-destructing before the curse gives him claws. The film's origin is proudly scrappy, Canadian indie energy, practical effects joy, and a tone that says this is not supposed to be taken too seriously. Once the transformation hits, the movie becomes a parade of pulpy pleasures with neon-lit nights, grimy bars, corrupt locals, and a hero who's suddenly more effective as a monster than he ever was as a man. As a werewolf film, Wolf Cop rules because it embraces the brutality without losing the fun. The creature work has weight, the violence is knowingly over the top, and the comedy comes from the world reacting to an impossible problem with very human stupidity. You get signature moments that feel built for cult worship, such as a transformation staged like a drunken miracle, a town realizing its law now has fangs, and the delicious moral grayness of a cursed man doing real good for the first time because the beast makes him fearless. Even the music credit helps keep the film buzzing like a midnight drive you shouldn't take. Its legacy is exactly what you want, a beloved genre oddball that plays better with every rewatch because you start spotting how cleverly it uses werewolf mythology as an excuse to satirize small-town rot. Ginger Snaps 2 Unleashed, 2004. I saw Ginger Snaps 2 Unleashed in 2004 when sequels were expected to go bigger, louder, and safer, and this one did the opposite. Director Brett Sullivan and writer Megan Martin take the first film's puberty as lycanthropy metaphor and drag it into something more nihilistic. Addiction, self-harm, obsession, and the terror of realizing the monster isn't a phase, it's a future. Brigitte, played by Emily Perkins, is the anchor, and the film's great trick is how it weaponizes her desperation. She's infected, she's fighting it with homemade chemistry and sheer will, and she ends up in a rehab facility that feels like a prison for people the world doesn't know what to do with. That setting is brilliant for a werewolf story. You have sterile hallways, locked doors, treatment that can't touch the real disease, and a steady sense that the system is just another predator. Then you add Ghost, one of the great unsettling supporting presences of early 2000s horror. Part ally, part mirror, part warning. I think it is safe to say that the film is meaner and more intimate than the original. There are fewer suburban panoramas, more claustrophobic dread, more body horror that feels like the skin is arguing with the soul. The iconic sequences are the ones where control slips. Kurt Swinghammer's score keeps it jittery and wrong, and the creature moments hit harder because they're tied to Brigitte's psychological unraveling. What makes it unique is its refusal to offer comfort. It's a werewolf sequel that treats survival as bargaining with yourself. The Cursed, 2021. The Cursed premiered under the title 8 for Silver, and it felt like gothic horror in its finest. Writer-director Sean Ellis builds a werewolf myth out of history, cruelty, and consequence, staging the curse not as random fate, but as violence coming home to collect. The setup is that of a classic folk nightmare with a nasty moral spine. A land baron commits an atrocity against a Romani clan, and soon the village starts bleeding. Children start disappearing, bodies are torn, and panic spreads like plague. Boyd Holbrook plays pathologist John McBride, an outsider invited in to explain the unexplainable, and that rational man versus irrational horror framework is where the film tightens the screws. Ellis shoots rural France like a bruised painting. Fog, firelight, iron tools, and fields that feel cursed even in daylight, while the score hums with dread like an omen you can't unhear. As a werewolf film, The Cursed stands out because it treats the monster as a system. Yes, there's creature horror, savage, physical, and staged with an almost clinical cruelty, but the deeper terror is the idea that privilege creates monsters and then pretends to be shocked by them. The best sequences are built on mounting inevitability, villagers turning on each other, the investigation revealing uglier truths, and set pieces where nightfall feels like a verdict. It's not the slick hunt the beast thrill, it's the grim realization that the beast is the bill coming due. What makes it such an essential choice is how it fuses folklore with guilt and colonial brutality, making the curse feel historically rooted rather than supernatural decoration. Press play and let it drag you into the mud. This is werewolf horror with teeth and conscience. Werewolves Within, 2001. I watched Werewolves Within during its 2021 run, and it was the perfect surprise. A cozy whodunit snowed in with a monster movie, executed with the kind of comedic timing that still respects the claws. Director Josh Rubin, working from Mishnah Wolf's script, adapts the Ubisoft game into something that feels less like a video game movie and more like a smart ensemble satire that happens to have a werewolf problem. A new forest ranger, Sam Richardson, arrives in tiny Beaverfield, Vermont, where everyone's already at war over a pipeline, and then a blizzard traps the townspeople together just as something starts killing. It plays like The Thing, filtered through small-town petty politics and improv comedy precision. Milana Vaintrobe's mail carrier is instantly magnetic, the supporting cast is stacked with lovable weirdos, and every conversation feels like it could turn into either a punchline or an accusation. As a werewolf film, this one is special because it understands the subgenre's oldest pleasure, paranoia. The monster is scary, sure, but the real fun is watching humans become beasts, lying, scapegoating, grabbing weapons, turning ideology into justification. The film's most memorable moments come from that escalating social collapse, flashlight searches, arguments that spiral into madness, reasonable people sounding unhinged, and sudden bursts of violence that remind you that the stakes are real. Anna Drubich's score keeps it nimble, bouncing between tension and sly warmth without ever deflating the dread. What makes it unique within the werewolf canon is the tone control. It's funny but not cheap, suspenseful but not dour, surprisingly sweet about human connection in the middle of chaos. I don't think you can look past this one if you claim to be a fan of the genre.
Kids got an act.
Big Bad Wolf, 2006. Back in 2006, when horror was stuffed with glossy remakes and straight-to-DVD chaos, Big Bad Wolf came like a welcome change. Lance W. Dreesen built it from the oldest campfire fuel imaginable, horny teenagers, a remote party spot, and the kind of local legend you laugh at until it starts laughing back. It's proudly low-budget and mean-spirited, but that's the charm, because the movie moves like it knows you came for nastiness, and it refuses to waste time pretending it's anything else. The setup is simple pressure cooker filmmaking. A group heads out for a weekend of bad decisions, and the countryside answers with a werewolf that feels less like a tragic cursed soul and more like a vulgar, predatory force of nature. The film's signature flavor is its nasty personality. The wolf is talkative, taunting, and cruel in a way that turns the whole thing into a sleazy fairy tale gone rotten. Kimberly J. Brown helps ground the chaos with a great intensity, and the best sequences trap you in that classic slasher rhythm. Highlights slicing in the dark, doors that won't hold, and panic turning friends into liabilities. As a werewolf movie, it earns its place by leaning into the beast as a bully, not a metaphor. The brutality is blunt, the humor is filthy, and the atmosphere is insane. It's not elegant, and it does not care. That's why it survives as a cult curiosity, as the kind of feral, trashy full moon watch you throw on at 1 a.m., half laughing, half wincing, and then realizing you're still listening for footsteps after the credits. The Beast Must Die, 1974. I first saw The Beast Must Die the way it's meant to be seen, with a crowd that starts smug and ends up suspicious of everyone in the room. Director Paul Annette and screenwriter Michael Winder take a whodunit structure and inject it with a werewolf logic, then dare you to play along. It's an Amicus Productions oddity with a genius gimmick like a deliberate pause that asks the audience to guess the monster before the movie tells you. It's camp, bold, and it's weirdly effective because it turns paranoia into a sport. The setup is pulpy to the core, and a millionaire hunter gathers guests at his mansion and announces calmly that one of them is a werewolf and therefore must die. The film plays like a cocktail party thriller until the claws start scraping at the edges, and the tension comes from manners cracking under primal fear. Peter Cushing brings that refined gravitas that makes every line sound like evidence, while Calvin Lockhart supplies swagger that slowly curdles into obsession. You remember the images, the candlelit corridors, guests watching each other too closely, nighttime hunts staged like ritual, and the creeping sense that civilized people become beasts long before any fur appears. As a werewolf film, it stands out because the monster is a mystery first, a social infection second, and only then a creature. The atmosphere is classic British gloom, the violence arrives with nasty punctuation, and the moral grayness is baked in. If you decide someone is a beast, how quickly do you start acting like one yourself? It's not the scariest werewolf movie, but it's one of the most playful in concept, and it makes this one entertaining because you start spotting tells, glances, and innocent choices that suddenly feel like confession. My Animal, 2023. In 2023, My Animal came along and reminded everyone that werewolf stories are, at their core, outsider romances with blood under the fingernails. Director Jacqueline Castell, working from Jay Matthews' script, frames lycanthropy as something you hide like a bruise and then sets it against teenage longing in an icy Canadian town. The film premiered at Sundance, and it is dreamy, moody, and emotionally sharp, like a love story told through clenched teeth. Heather, a goalie with a family that treats don't draw attention as a religion, is carrying a curse she's been ordered to contain. Then she meets Johnny, a figure skater who feels like movement and possibility, and suddenly the wolf isn't only horror, it's temptation. Bobby Salvor Menguez plays Heather with a guarded physicality that makes every new desire feel dangerous, while Amandla Stenberg plays a magnetic softness that turns the romance into a genuine lifeline. The iconic moments are emotional ruptures, with the body beginning to betray the rules, the full moon turning intimacy into threat, red-lit fantasy bleeding into reality, and the awful realization that the people protecting you might be the ones keeping you trapped. As a werewolf movie, it works because it treats transformation as identity, not spectacle. The brutality is there when it needs to be, but the real bite is in shame, control, and the fear of being seen. That's why it's a must-watch, and it sticks with you because it understands the most human part of the wolf myth, the hunger to be loved without being caged. Trick or Treat, 2007. I saw Trick or Treat the year it started circulating, and it felt like Halloween itself had been distilled into 4 sinister little shots of folklore. Writer-director Michael Dougherty structures it like an anthology mixtape, different stories, same night, same rules, with the tiny demon Sam acting like the holiday's living conscience. It's not a werewolf movie in the traditional sense, but its werewolf segment is one of the nastiest, smartest twists on lycanthropy in modern horror, and it absolutely earns a seat at the full moon table. A small town on Halloween takes a sinister turn when people breaking traditions and consequences arrive with a grin. The film's power is tone. It's playful but cruel, like a bedtime story told by someone who wants you to learn something. Then the werewolf thread hits and the movie changes temperature. Anna Paquin anchors the segment with a mischievous vulnerability that turns into something sharper, and the sequence plays like a midnight rite. You remember the images: lantern glow against black woods, laughter that sounds like hunting calls, and the delicious snap when the monster mythology flips perspective. The movie works because it treats transformation as community, as pack logic, and as appetite with rules. The brutality lands harder because it's framed as celebration, not tragedy, and that makes it feel uniquely Halloween: horror as tradition, violence as ritual, and identity as costume you can finally stop pretending in. Its legacy is cult immortality, as it is endlessly rewatchable, loaded with little connective details, and perfect for that annual October ritual where you want something that feels like candy with razors in it. I Was a Teenage Werewolf, 1957. In 1957, Teen Rebellion was the new monster, and I Was a Teenage Werewolf sprinted straight at it with B-movie audacity. Director Gene Fowler Jr. and producer-writer Herman Cohen took the era's fear of juvenile delinquency and literalized it into fur, fangs, and uncontrollable rage. American International Pictures knew exactly why this got greenlit. It was cheap, timely, and guaranteed to pull kids into drive-ins like Gravity. A troubled teen becomes the subject of a hypnotherapist's experiment, and the transformation turns adolescent anger into predation. Michael Landon is the secret weapon, all jittery vulnerability until the beast takes over, and the film's best sequences are built on that whiplash. A boy who can't fit into the world, suddenly becoming something the world can't survive. It's not slick, but it's vivid. Alleyways and classrooms as pressure chambers, authority figures talking like they understand while making everything worse, and the creeping sense that help is just another form of control. I find this movie to be one of the clearest expressions of the genre's core engine: transformation as loss of agency. The brutality is modest by modern standards, but the horror is psychological, watching a kid get pushed, poked, and pathologized until the animal answer feels inevitable. And the themes still land, with adults manufacturing monsters, society punishing symptoms instead of causes, and the tragedy of becoming exactly what everybody already expected you to be. It's regarded as a cornerstone of teen horror and a time capsule of how culture demonized youth. The Boy Who Cried Werewolf, 1973. There's a particular kind of 1970s horror that feels like it's happening just off the highway, and The Boy Who Cried Werewolf lives there. Director Nathan H. Juran came out of retirement to make it, and you can feel the old-school craftsmanship in how the film builds dread with simple tools like moonlight, suspicion, and the heartbreak of not being believed. It's a story engineered to make the audience complicit, because you know the kid is right, and you have to watch everyone around him decide he's just being dramatic. A boy visits his father at a secluded cabin, they're attacked, and the father is bitten, then begins changing. The sheriff and the adults want a rational explanation, a drifter, a misunderstanding, anything except the impossible. Kerwin Matthews plays the father with a restrained panic that slowly turns inward, like he can feel the wolf mapping itself onto his bones. The film's most memorable moments are built on proximity: a quiet domestic scene that suddenly feels unsafe, a trip back to the cabin meant to prove everything is normal, and the way the boy's warnings become an emotional scream. It's a werewolf movie that understands how isolation works. I will rank this quite highly among werewolf movies because it succeeds by making the curse feel like a family tragedy first and a creature feature second. The violence hits in sharp bursts, but the real horror is watching love turn into a liability when nobody wants to name what's happening. Its cult reputation comes from that specific tone, a grounded, TV-era seriousness with just enough savagery to sting. The Curse of the Werewolf, 1961. In 1961, Hammer Film Productions finally turned its gothic machine toward lycanthropy, and The Curse of the Werewolf came out looking like a stained glass nightmare. Director Terence Fisher gives the film that classic Hammer texture, candlelit dread, moral rot, old-world cruelty, and then drops a young Oliver Reed into the center like a bomb with a heartbeat. It's based on The Werewolf of Paris, but reshaped into a Spanish Gothic tragedy where the curse is born from violence, shame, and social hypocrisy. The broad setup is pure doomed folklore, a child marked from birth, raised under fear and superstition, and pulled toward a fate the town will punish him for the moment it surfaces. Fisher stages key sequences like dark rituals. The prison and the tavern both feel like cages, and when the full moon arrives, it's not liberating, it's a sentence. The film's iconic power comes from contrasts, warm human interiors against cold, predatory night, a romance that feels like a last breath, and the sense that the real villain isn't the wolf, it's the world that created the conditions for the wolf to exist. I love how the movie treats lycanthropy as gothic inevitability. The brutality is there, but the bigger bite is tragic. You watch a man fight himself, then watch society decide that killing him is simpler than understanding him. That moral grayness is the point. The film dares you to pity the monster and fear the humans, sometimes in the same scene. This is one of the key, serious werewolf films that gave the subgenre a romantic, doomed spine. The Wolfman, 2010. When The Wolfman arrived in 2010, it felt like a big studio trying to resurrect old Universal monster grandeur with modern blood. Director Joe Johnston and star producer Benicio del Toro aimed for gothic spectacle, foggy forests, ancestral estates, grief that curdles into rage, and transformation staged like a violent operatic event. On paper, it's the classic template, a return home, a family curse, a beast stalking the village. But the movie's real hook is its commitment to period mood and tactile brutality, the sense that every bite has weight. The setup is all tragedy and suspicion. A man comes back to his ancestral world only to find it infested with secrets and claw marks, and the investigation becomes a descent into family rot. Anthony Hopkins is the film's toxic gravity, making every conversation feel like manipulation wrapped in elegance, while Emily Blunt brings warmth that the story keeps threatening to extinguish. The iconic sequences are the ones that go full monster movie, a transformation that feels like bones arguing with skin, a rampage staged with old-school savagery, and chase beats where the night looks alive with fear. As a werewolf film, it works because it embraces the monster as both horror and inheritance. The violence is extravagant, but the emotional through line is grief and identity. The dread of realizing the beast is not an intruder, it's your bloodline demanding its due. Whatever you think of its script, it's a must-watch for the craftsmanship of big-budget gothic horror. For me, this is special as a film people return to for atmosphere and set pieces, and it plays best as a dark fairy tale, grand, messy, and full moon committed.
Daddy, wake up!
The Beast Within, 2024. I watched The Beast Within in 2024 expecting Kit Harington Does Werewolf, and got something moodier and more intimate, a family nightmare told through a child's eyes, where the monster is not out in the woods, it's at the dinner table. Director Alexander J. Farrell builds the film like a slow tightening collar, remote English wilderness, a farmhouse that feels like it's keeping secrets, and a little girl, Willow, piecing together the truth one frightening night at a time. The film leans into practical effects and minimal CGI, and that old-school approach matters because the horror here is about presence. The beast feels like it could actually be in the room with you. Willow witnesses her father transform under the full moon, and suddenly, family becomes a containment protocol. Kit Harington plays the father with a wounded, cornered intensity, and Ashley Cummings gives the mother a quiet desperation that sells the film's moral grayness. Love expressed as restraint, protection expressed as imprisonment. The film's most memorable moments come from the child's perspective. I think that the movie is less about hunting and more about inheritance. The fear is not, can we kill the beast? It's, can we live with the beast and still be a family? That emotional angle gives it bite beyond the usual full moon carnage, and when violence erupts, it lands like a rupture in trust. It's a grim bedtime story about what parents hide and what children inherit. Wolfwalkers 2020. In 2020, Wolfwalkers proved you could make a wolf story that feels like a spell, not a scare, and still hit the same primal nerve. Co-directors Tom Moore and Ross Stewart, working through Cartoon Saloon, crafted a folklore epic where transformation is freedom and danger in the same breath. It's part of Moore's Irish folklore tragedy, and you can feel the ambition. Hand-drawn artistry that makes the forest look alive, like the trees are watching, like the wind has opinions. The setup is storybook sharp. A young hunter in training arrives in a colonized Ireland where wolves are treated as vermin and the woods are treated as a problem to be solved. Then she meets a wild girl, a wolfwalker, and the entire moral map flips. The film's iconic sequences are the ones where the human world and the wolf world collide in pure visual music. Dreams of running through moonlit forests, bodies slipping between forms with a natural grace, and the city's rigid geometry clashing against the forest's flowing lines. The score, with Bruno Kaules and the band Kila, pushes the story into myth, making every chase feel like a legend being born. I would say this is a must-watch because it reframes the monster as misunderstood nature and the true villain as fear dressed up as order. The emotional through line is friendship, rebellion, and the moment a child realizes the rules they were taught are built on cruelty. It is gorgeous, rewatchable, and layered enough that each viewing reveals new political and emotional teeth beneath the beauty. Wolfman 2025. I went into Wolfman in 2025 wanting a modern monster movie with bite, and what Leigh Whannell delivers is a family horror story that treats lycanthropy like infection, like paranoia, like your own body turning into a crime scene. It's a reboot powered by Blumhouse Productions, instincts, intimate scale, escalating dread, and the conviction that the scariest thing in the room is the person you love changing in front of you. The story is classic and cruel, where a husband and father, Blake, tries to protect his wife and daughter after an attack at a remote home, only to realize the real threat is inside his bloodstream. Christopher Abbott plays the deterioration with raw physical anxiety, the kind that makes you flinch before the claws even arrive, and Julia Garner brings a terrified steadiness that turns final girl energy into something more specific, a partner watching the person she trusts become unsafe. Whannell's horror is built on perspective shifts and sensory unease, and the film's best sequences feel like survival drama more than monster pageant. Flashlight beams cutting through black forest, a house becoming a trap, and the sickening logic of a transformation you can't bargain with. As a werewolf film, it stands out for how human it keeps the terror. This is about the shame of losing control, the fear of hurting your family, and the brutal intimacy of being restrained by people who love you. The film will be remembered, partly because the design choices sparked loud reactions, which is honestly fitting for a movie about a monster that makes people argue about what they're seeing. If you want a modern full moon movie that plays like a panic attack, this one earns the press play immediately slot. Viking Wolf 2022. I watched Viking Wolf right when it landed, and it scratched a very specific itch. It uses a concept that never gets dull as a teenage body horror fused to a Scandinavian police procedural, all cold secrets. Director Stig Svensson builds the film like a local tragedy that slowly reveals its mythic teeth, and I cannot get over the grimmick Nordic patience in how it lets dread accumulate. The story follows a family that relocates to a small town. Thale tries to reset her life, and then a grotesque murder at a party becomes the spark that ignites everything. Meanwhile, her mother, a police officer, is pulled into the investigation, so the film keeps cutting between official facts and the private horror of transformation. That dual-track structure is the hook. The town wants a culprit, Thale's body is becoming evidence, and nobody knows they're racing the same clock. As a werewolf film, Viking Wolf earns its bite by making lycanthropy feel like adolescence weaponized. It's invasive with all the visions, urges, hunger, and shame played against chilly landscapes, and the horror fluorescent realism of institutions trying to categorize what shouldn't exist. You get sequences that stick, and you will enjoy the moonlit pursuit where the dark feels alive, interrogation rooms where adults talk like control is possible, and those awful quiet moments where Thale realizes the monster isn't outside anymore. The music and cinematography keep everything taut, like the forest is leaning in. What makes it stand out for me is its emotional through line, the tragedy of a kid losing autonomy while the adults around her mistake panic for solutions. It's a creature feature that doubles as a coming-of-age bruise. If you like your werewolves modern, mean, and grounded in real-world consequences, this one absolutely belongs on the must-watch list. Game of Werewolves. The early 2010s were a great time for horror comedy to get shameless again, and Lobos de Arga, released internationally as Game of Werewolves, leans into that shamelessness with a grin full of fangs. Director-screenwriter Juan Martinez Moreno takes an old-school curse setup and plays it like a Looney Tunes siege movie that still remembers to be scary when the moon hits. The premise is intriguing, and you have a struggling writer who returns to his ancestral village in Galicia, lured by civic ceremony and hometown nostalgia, only to discover his bloodline comes with a century-old lycanthrope claws. The village itself is the secret weapon. The whetstone, narrow roads, suspicious locals, and that sense that everyone knows more than they're saying, because living with this curse gets to you after a point. Gorko Otzoa plays the reluctant center with perfect "why is my life like this" energy, while the supporting cast turns the town into a carnival of cowardice, greed, and folk superstition. The comedy comes from human panic and bad plans, not from defanging the threat. When the creature arrives, it's a genuine engine of chaos, chasing people through woods, slamming into cramped spaces, forcing alliances between characters who can barely stand each other. You get memorable set pieces built on escalation, rituals that go wrong, improvised defenses that collapse, and the gradual realization that the town's traditions are just survival strategies with nicer names. Its cult status comes from that balance where you watch it for laughs, but the full moon momentum still bites. I really admire how cleverly it uses small-town politics and family legacy as the real curse, making the creature feel like the punchline the village earned. I know there are many other notable werewolf flicks that have entertained the horror fans, but these are my picks for the underrated gems. Let me know in the comments below what you think of these films, and I would love to hear about your favorites from the list.